Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Will Pomerantz, and I am the director of the Kennan Institute. I want to thank you all for joining us today to discuss the history and legacy of the Great Soviet Encyclopedia. I encourage you all to stay up to date on the latest Kennan Institute events and publications by visiting our website and subscribing to our two blogs, Focus Ukraine and the Russia File, as well as our podcast. Also visit our Hindsight Upfront Ukraine collection on the Wilson website for the latest news and analysis focused on Ukraine. Finally, again, I would like to take a moment to thank the Department of State's Title VIII program for their generous support of several of the Kennan Institute's fellowships, which has allowed us to host rising scholars in the field, such as today's guest, Dr. Michael Coates. If you have a question for our speaker, please use the Q&A feature in Zoom rather than raising your hand. We will be monitoring the Q&A throughout the event, and we'll move to your questions following the presentation. A brief introduction: Michael Coates is an independent researcher whose interests include the history of science and technology in Russia and the Soviet Union, intellectual history, and the history of knowledge. Michael Coates completed his PhD in history at the University of California, Berkeley. His dissertation explored the history of the Great Soviet Encyclopedia, which aimed to reconstruct all of human knowledge in accordance with the principles of dialectical and historical materialism. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So this talk is a summary of the work that I've been doing here at the Wilson Center as part of my Title VIII Fund project on the history of the Great Soviet Encyclopedia, which I'm currently working to develop into a book manuscript. And so in this talk, I'm going to try to give a general trajectory of the whole history of this encyclopedia, rather than focusing in depth on one specific part of its history. That being said, I'm happy in the Q&A to go into greater depth to answer any questions about any aspect of the encyclopedia's history that may interest you. Now, the Great Soviet Encyclopedia, Большая Советская Encyclopedia in Russian, or as I'm often going to call it in this talk, the BSE, was the Soviet Union's primary universal encyclopedia. It went through 3 editions, each of which was rewritten almost entirely from scratch. And these editions existed at some very interesting cultural and ideological junctures in Soviet history. The first edition was launched in 1924, and though it was initially expected to take only 3 years to complete, ultimately it was not completed until 1947. It had 66 volumes total, 65 numbered volumes, and 1 volume consisting solely of the article on the Soviet Union. The second edition was already being planned before the first was finished, and it was officially announced in 1949. It was not, however, completed until 1958, by which point Stalin had died and the Soviet Union was in the midst of the thaw. That edition had 51 volumes, 50 regular ones, and a volume of additional articles that was published last that I'm going to talk about later. There was then a third edition that was released in 30 volumes from 1969 to 78, and there were proposals for a 4th edition in the 80s, although those were never fulfilled. So the history of the BSE spans almost the whole Soviet period, and this is one of the things that makes it such a unique object of study. It allows you to follow the changes in what one might call the Soviet Union's official knowledge system across the whole Soviet period. But as I'm going to discuss today, the BSE did not merely reflect the state of knowledge and ideology in the Soviet Union, but rather it was intended to play an active and central role in its reconstruction. It was a revolutionary project that was supposed to effect a transformation in the realm of knowledge, remaking it in accordance with the principles of the Marxist philosophies of dialectical and historical materialism. It aimed to break down the barriers that so-called bourgeois anti-materialist scholarship had erected between the disciplines, and to create a new kind of unified and distinctively Soviet science. Its writing was supposed to bring together the Soviet Union's leading Marxist and materialist scholars from every field of knowledge, systematically organizing and structuring their work by providing them with a program of research and writing, which would force them to reevaluate and reinterpret all of knowledge, or at least all of the knowledge thought to be useful for the new proletarian state. The BSE was to be the country's universal factual and ideological reference, a collective work that would both create and propagandize the party line to the masses. But why was an encyclopedia thought to be such a useful tool for this task? I would suggest that encyclopedias as a genre have very frequently appealed to individuals and groups who were aiming to transform or to reorganize knowledge as a whole, especially those who perceive themselves on the outside of existing knowledge systems, and that the BSE can be placed in this longer intellectual tradition. Leibniz had envisioned an academy that would have as its main intellectual product an ideally organized encyclopedia, and he attempted to convince Peter the Great to sponsor it. Diderot and D'Alembert had characterized their encyclopedia as a machine of war that would do battle with existing scholastic knowledge systems, while also anticipating the future course of the nation and helping to shape its development through the knowledge that would be contained in the encyclopedia. Likewise, Hegel's Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences, which is encyclopedic but not traditional in its format, had attempted to show the dialectical links between all areas of knowledge. And Engels had attempted the same task in his book, his unfinished book, Dialectics of Nature, in which he described the need for what he called a, quote, encyclopedic summing up of the outlook on nature that he and Marx were inaugurating. But within the Russian Empire, the BSE's most important intellectual predecessors were Alexander Bogdanov's two attempts to create what he called a workers' or proletarian encyclopedia. The first in primarily 1908 to 1909 on the island of Capri, in collaboration with the writer Maxim Gorky, the historian Mikhail Pokrovsky, the literary critic Anatoly Lunacharsky, and others, and the second after the revolution as part of the proletarian culture movement. Bogdanov was fond of saying that the Bible was the encyclopedia of the Judeo-Christian worldview, and he thought that the bourgeoisie had crystallized and systematized its ideology in Diderot's Encyclopédie. Accordingly, he thought that it would be necessary for the proletariat to create its own encyclopedia, which would be as authoritative for them as the Bible is for Christians. He thought that each class produced its own form of cognition, which consisted of concepts, forms of thought, laws of thought, and so on, through a process that he called world building. And since writing an encyclopedia requires one to come up with something to say about everything worth knowing, and since its pages are a depiction of the world, which need not be the real world, but can rather be a world that one hopes to bring into existence, Bogdanov thought that the production of a proletarian encyclopedia was essential for bringing about a proletarian cultural revolution and thus creating the new world of communism. And those of you who are familiar with the story, Sono Boribus Tertius by Jorge Luis Borges may see some parallels there. So these intellectual traditions influenced the creation of the BSE. And while Bogdanov himself was not involved in the project, most of his collaborators, including all of the people on this screen except Gorky, were. But there was also a very concrete reason why this new encyclopedia project was launched, which was the question of what should be done with one of Russia's major pre-revolutionary encyclopedias, Granat. At the time of the revolution, Granat's publisher was partway through a massively expanded new edition. And when the publisher came under public ownership, a decision had to be made as to whether to continue its publication or not. This question was discussed at the very first meeting of the editorial board of Gosselstadt, its new state publisher, in 1919. And in short, it was decided that the project could not be salvaged and that a new encyclopedia would need to be produced. The project, which received its official approval in 1924, would be headed by Otto Julius Schmidt, a 32-year-old mathematician and genuine polymath who had been the director of Gosselstadt and the project's primary promoter. Bogdanov's collaborator, Mikhail Pokrovsky, and the party official Valerian Kubyshev would serve as the project's main political overseers, with the latter being the main liaison with the Politburo. Now, the proposal that was approved by the Politburo promised that the encyclopedia would be, quote, a monument of an epoch, fixing at the most urgent moment the Marxist understanding of every individual social phenomenon and a sharply materialist understanding of natural science, end quote, and that its creation would be, quote, a matter of huge political significance for an entire generation and maybe more than one. Schmidt assembled a talented team of scholars, writers, and publishing workers to plan the new edition. Among them, a particularly important role was played by the famous symbolist writer Valery Brusov, who was responsible for most of the encyclopedia's structural design. Although, as it happens, he actually became ill and died before the first volume was released in 1926. Nevertheless, most of his design choices were retained for the entire history of the three editions. The new editors promised that the encyclopedia would be free of what they called the entire mass of trash that imperial Russian encyclopedias included, and that had, they said, made their way into these encyclopedias under the influence of bourgeois German encyclopedias. They said their encyclopedia would provide the knowledge and the ideological outlook necessary for contemporary life, and would do so from a unified philosophical perspective. The editors believed that the development of such a broad-based, unified system of general knowledge among the Soviet population was essential for the building of communism, And the aspiration was that this new encyclopedia would be accessible to a wide range of readers, including workers who had graduated from a Raubfach and thus had roughly a high school level of education. And so with these goals in mind, they set out to create the new encyclopedia. The project attracted a great deal of enthusiasm when it was first announced, with many individuals and organizations seeking to be a part of it. The Georgian branch of the Commissariat of Enlightenment, for example, wrote to request that Georgian scholars be involved in writing it. But the project immediately proved to be quite a bit more difficult than anticipated, and the editors had to repeatedly increase both the number of volumes and the amount of time that would be needed to complete the project. Now, these first couple years were one of the most experimental periods in the publisher's history, as the editors and contributors to the encyclopedia worked to try to creatively reinterpret knowledge in the way that I've described. However, the publisher experienced very significant difficulties in finding and retaining qualified editors for its full-time staff, and there were frequent internal conflicts between the editors who were party members and the majority who were not, especially when the publisher's party cell was in the process of being formed. They also made efforts to recruit contributors from abroad. So, for example, Walter Benjamin came to Moscow with the intention of contributing articles on Goethe and other topics, although he and the editors could not come to an agreement about the style in which the article should be written. And ultimately, he left Moscow, basically cursing the editors. But most consequential was the limited degree of support that the project was receiving from the Communist Academy in these early years. The Academy had an ownership stake in the publisher and was supposed to assist in its creation, but in reality, it had very few concrete obligations to the project. The project's editorial board, which included many prominent party officials like Nikolai Bukharin and Paul Radek, became fairly disengaged from the project within just a few years, with its meetings becoming increasingly poorly attended. And so the most important work at the publisher continued to be done by Schmidt and by his team, as well as by the full-time staff of editors that had been recruited to work on the project. Among them, a particularly important role was played by Fyodor Petrov, who was Schmidt's long-serving deputy and a medical doctor by training. He actually remained with the publisher until his death in 1973, at which point he was the oldest of the old Bolsheviks, having been involved in the social democratic movement since 1896. Now, as the editors worked to produce the encyclopedia, the political and cultural situation of the Soviet Union was changing, and the country is generally said to have entered a new period of cultural revolution beginning in 1928. And the publisher was actually able to weather the first few years of the Cultural Revolution better than one might have expected. But the situation changed in 1930 when the encyclopedia began to come under especially heavy criticism, especially from within the Communist Academy and its associated organizations. And this is likely not a coincidence. In 1930, the Soviet publishing industry was consolidated and the encyclopedia's publisher was merged with several others, eliminating the Communist Academy's ownership stake in it. And the decisive moment came in December of that year when a joint meeting of the BSC's leadership, the leadership of the Association of Natural Sciences, Association for the Natural Sciences of the Communist Academy, and the Natural Sciences Department of the Institute of Red Professors, which is another new educational institution, was held to criticize the treatment of the sciences in the encyclopedia. Well, several key developments took place at this meeting. First, the importance of the project and the role that it would have in Soviet society were reaffirmed. Second, it was resolved that the articles should do more to incorporate not merely a materialist perspective into the articles on the natural sciences, but rather a dialectical materialist approach. And as a part of this, there was an increased emphasis on the importance of the history of science for achieving the kind of philosophical unity that had always been the project's goal. It was understood that writing about the history of particular sciences from a historical materialist perspective would help to identify the type of bourgeois metaphysics that the encyclopedia was supposed to be rooting out, and would help to locate the areas in which links could be drawn between different fields of study. And this, it should be noted, has much in common with the Western unity of science movement that was popular at the time, whose participants like George Sardin and Otto Neurath often emphasized the importance of the history of science for achieving unity in the sciences, and who often had socialist political objectives as a part of these projects. Third, it was resolved that the encyclopedia should make more reference to the works of Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Stalin, right, the so-called classics of Marxism-Leninism. Facing political pressure, Schmidt actually wrote in one letter that, quote, "The BSE should, on the whole, be a specific commentary on the writings of Lenin and the resolutions of the party," which is very different from his original conception. The BSE would help to digest the significance of these writings, expounding upon them and bringing a degree of systematicity and comprehensiveness to their interpretation. It would form a commentary on authoritative respects that in certain respects could be said to be reminiscent of scholastic modes of inquiry. Now, the recommendations that were made at this meeting were adopted, and it was recognized that the encyclopedia would aim for, quote, the reconstruction of all of science in accordance with the tasks of socialist construction on the basis of the general line of the party and the ruthless struggle with every kind of deviation from the Leninist line in every area of knowledge. And in support of these goals, Schmidt increased his efforts to recruit new editors to the project, focusing in particular on younger graduates of institutions like the Institute of Red Professors. I have here two examples. Milica Nyechkina, who worked as a history editor there from 1930 to 33, and Dmitry Shapilov, who worked as an economics editor while studying at the Institute. Both would have very prominent careers. Shapilov went on to serve as foreign minister, head of Agitprop, and editor-in-chief of Pravda, among other positions. And Nyechkina would become one of the country's most distinguished historians, known especially for her work on the Decembrist movement. She also kept a work journal that is one of the most important primary sources for the history of this period, showing what life was like as an editor of the encyclopedia. And from this, we can see that the job was one that required a great deal of work, as well as the ability to rewrite articles on any topic within one's subject area when required. The editors, like the authors, often engaged in significant original research and frequently held discussions of longer articles with outside experts. During these storm periods when deadlines were approaching, the editors often wrote articles themselves from scratch rather than commissioning them from outside authors. And her journal also reveals that staff editors were in close contact with the publisher's leadership. Now, these practices continued as the 1930s went on, but the publisher's political difficulties began to mount. Pokrovsky died in 1932 and Kuleshov in 35, leaving the project without its political overseers and without a direct link to the Politburo. Terror also affected the publisher, although not quite in the way that's generally understood. But while many of the members of the editorial board were arrested and executed, the board, as I noted, was for the most part not heavily engaged in the day-to-day work of the publisher at this point. At least 15 of the encyclopedia's staff members were arrested. However, in every case for which documentation exists, which is not all of the cases, the arrested individual actually was not accused of having committed the crime at the encyclopedia, right? The allegation was that they'd committed their crime, supposed crime, somewhere else, right? In some other job that they had held or, in their free time. As far as I can tell, no one was accused of wrecking the encyclopedia, even though it was by this point nearly a decade behind its original production timeline. And no one was accused of running a Trotskyist, a Menshevik, or an anarchist cell at the publisher, even though former members of all of those groups worked there. Work that was done by arrested individuals could still be included in the BSc. When the staff editor, Jan Sten, the author of the article on philosophy, was arrested, they simply removed his name from the article and replaced it with the name of Mark Meaton, who was one of the lead editors for philosophy, one of the lead kind of outside editors. And when this was revealed 3 decades later, it provoked a major scandal in the Soviet philosophical community, helping to contribute to its de-Stalinization, as he even lost some of the positions he had held. But even so, it was recognized that the changing political winds would require the encyclopedia to be updated. And in a 1937 letter to Stalin and others, Schmidt proposed that the second edition should be published in what was essentially a binder, so that articles could be very easily replaced for factual or ideological reasons. Now, to what extent can the first edition be said to have achieved its goals of creating a new Marxist and Soviet version of knowledge? Well, in 1932, Schmidt himself conceded that, quote, there's not yet a detailed Marxist classification of the natural sciences in an article on the natural sciences that he wrote for the BSc. Even so, he stressed that new fields of knowledge were emerging at the intersections of existing disciplines, and that these new fields were dialectical in their approach. Turning to the history of science, he highlighted the importance of describing historical developments in the division of the sciences and critiquing them from a Marxist perspective. We quote, reconstruction on the basis of the materialist dialectic would create, quote, a completely different division of the natural sciences. But Schmidt argued, quote, we are only at the beginning of this path. The new classification would emerge in connection with practice, he said, but in the meantime, it was better to have no explicit classification of knowledge than an artificial one that could turn out to be harmful. Most of the work on the final volumes of the first edition was complete by 1940, but delays at the printers and the beginning of World War II meant that the last volume was not released until 1947. Even before the first edition was complete, though, a second edition was being planned. This time, the project's leadership was chosen directly by the Politburo, with Andrei Vyshinsky, who's most noted for serving as the prosecutor general during the terror, as the initial editor-in-chief, and the historian and sociologist of technology, Anatoly Zvorikhin, as his deputy. Zvorikhin had worked both as an academic and in the publishing industry, most recently serving as the lead science editor at Pravda. And he began to recruit new staff editors with both academic backgrounds and backgrounds in journalism. In the latter case, primarily to staff the National Control Redakция, which was the publisher's main ideological control center. And in doing so, he often hired individuals who'd been fired from other positions for political reasons or due to anti-Semitism. Vyshinsky was replaced after around 2 months by Sergei Vavilov, pictured here, a physicist who was serving as president of the Academy of Sciences and notably was not a member of the Communist Party. And the switch proved to be quite fateful because Vavilov was able to use his power and influence in both the scientific and political communities to assist the encyclopedia. And a particularly important development, he was able to secure resolutions from both the Academy of Sciences and the Ministry of Higher Education that obligated all universities and research institutes to assist with the encyclopedia, and especially with reviewing articles upon request. In particular, institutions were often asked to organize discussions of draft versions of articles, where they would be subjected to the Soviet principles of criticism, and if the author was present, self-criticism. As a rule, all of the longer articles were to be discussed in this manner, and around 10,000 organized discussions of articles were held for the second edition. These discussions could include faculty, graduate students, and in some cases even undergraduates, and there were even records of discussions that were held in factories and other industrial facilities. Articles were also reviewed at the highest levels of the government and the Communist Party apparatus, and articles about foreign socialist countries were sent to the leaders of those countries for review. Now, discussions became a hallmark of the Soviet encyclopedia production system and had the effect of making the second edition, so far as I can tell, the most heavily vetted work in the history of encyclopedias up to that point. Another effect of this process, as I see it, is that it turned the BSE into something that its editors hoped it would be from the beginning, a way of bringing the Soviet intelligentsia together to rethink and remake all of human knowledge. This is especially significant given the context in which the second edition was being produced. The immediate post-war years saw many major initiatives in the realms of knowledge and ideology, from the debates over various academic fields to the anti-cosmopolitan and anti-formalist campaigns, the issue of patriotism and national priority in science, and the founding of new knowledge institutions like Znanya and new journals. The second edition of the BSE, which was launched in the midst of all of this, was supposed to systematize, help guide, and ultimately to crystallize in an authoritative form the results of all of these initiatives, while also expanding these new ideological perspectives to areas where they had not been applied before. So the second edition was thus, even though the Soviet Union had existed for around 3 decades at this point, still fundamentally a creative or constructive project and not merely reflecting existing knowledge or ideas. Like the Encyclopédie did battle with feudalism, the BSE was supposed to do battle with the bourgeoisie, becoming, as Pravda put it, quote, worthy of our great socialist epoch, and, quote, the best encyclopedia in the world. But Stalin died in 1953, and the second edition was not completed until 1958. And so the ensuing period of the thaw again drew the editors into the difficult situation of trying to chart a new course for the development of Soviet knowledge, as well as the problem of dealing with the element of Stalin's personality cult that was pervasive in the early volumes. And so in what is likely the most famous incident in the history of the encyclopedia, subscribers received a note instructing them to cut out the article on Lavrent Beria, Stalin's former secret police chief, and to replace it with extended articles on the Bering Sea and George Barclay. The instruction came from the publisher, which had in turn been ordered to take action by Globlit, the country's main censorship organ. Now, this was part of a broader campaign to remove from public circulation works that had images of Beria or that had praised him too highly. But it also represented a fairly unique development in Soviet censorship, in that previous directives had generally applied to books that were in libraries and bookstores, and not to books that were in people's personal collections. As it happens, however, the task of expunging Beria from the encyclopedia proved to be impossible. He was mentioned extensively in other articles, especially the article on Georgia, and not all of them could be replaced. And so Beria, therefore, could not be completely eliminated from the world of the Soviet Encyclopedia. And I'll just note this same tactic was later applied to the article on Gao Gong, that was a Chinese communist official who had been purged. And it was proposed that it be used to replace the article on Mahatma Gandhi, which had been very critical of him, calling him an agent of British imperialism and a representative of the bourgeois merchant caste. The idea was that they might replace it with a more positive portrayal because the original version, needless to say, had greatly angered the Indian government and provoked an international incident. Now, there was very significant experimentation at the publisher during the thaw, and the editors sometimes tried to push the boundaries of what could be included in the encyclopedia, partially in response to a letter from a group of scholars in Kiev that had criticized it for containing too much ideological terminology and not enough factual material. The editors sought to include more material of this factual type in the encyclopedia, pushing back against Gloplit when necessary. They also began to challenge the dominance of Lysenkovist ideas in the biological sciences, even though Lysenko remained powerful throughout the Khrushchev era. And in a particularly striking act, they published a supplemental 51st volume to the encyclopedia, which contained articles on many figures who had been purged and other topics that could not have been discussed under Stalin. And this included an article on the late Sergei Vavilov's brother, Nikolai, a geneticist who had been arrested and died in prison. In spite of the changing political circumstances that it faced, the production of the second edition went in general much more smoothly than the first. The publisher suffered fewer staffing problems than it did during the first edition, and improvements were made to the editorial process to facilitate the encyclopedia's production. One important development was the increased use of article schemata, which had been introduced during the first edition, but expanded for the second. And these schemata provided articles with sort of skeleton frameworks around which articles in particular fields of knowledge could be written, helping to bring a degree of unity to the encyclopedia. After the completion of the second edition, the publisher produced many specialized encyclopedias in different fields of knowledge. It also expanded its international ties with publishers in both socialist countries and in the West, including some very interesting exchanges with the Encyclopedia Britannica. It should also be noted, beginning in the 1950s, that the Union Republics of the Soviet Union began to establish their own publishers to produce encyclopedias in their national languages. This started with the Ukrainian Soviet Encyclopedia, headed by Mykola Bazhin, but would eventually include every Union Republic except Russia. And these encyclopedias often served as important venues for developing knowledge about the national culture of the republics that produced them in the language of those republics. Several projects of this type had been attempted previously in the late 20s and early 30s as part of the Karnizatsia campaign, but none of those were completed and published at that time. And the BSE's publisher often collaborated with these new publishers in the Union Republics, forming a network of institutions that could work together. But at the same time, these encyclopedias sometimes offered differing takes on the Soviet knowledge system. Now, the publisher had already begun planning the third edition by 1964. These efforts were led by Boris Yaginsky, who had replaced Vavilov as the editor-in-chief after his death, and Lev Shalmyan, the deputy editor-in-chief, as well as Alexei Revin, who was the publisher's director. And in justifying this new project, the publisher's leadership pointed out that the problems of the Stalin-era volumes, the problem that these Stalin-era volumes posed, as well as the new developments in science and technology that needed to be incorporated into the encyclopedia. Official authorization from the Politburo came in 1966, and the first volume was released in 1969. And that the editors had been instructed to combat for this third edition, not only bourgeois philosophy, but also the revisionist version of Marxism that was said to be emanating from China in the aftermath of the Sino-Soviet split. At the same time, the rhetoric about the reconstruction of science that had been so characteristic of the earlier editions was toned down significantly for this third edition. An increased emphasis was placed on factual content, and while the publication was still supposed to be party-minded, there were clear efforts being made to make the project less overtly ideological and to bring Soviet knowledge more into line with what one might call Western knowledge systems of the era. And in fact, Sergei Kovalyov, who replaced Shalmyan as deputy editor-in-chief after his death in 1971, argued that while criticism of bourgeois scholars was necessary, it should not be done in an unfair way, but rather their, quote, methodological mistakes should be identified so that, quote, it may be possible to attract them to our worldview. While these efforts were generally welcomed by the members of the Academy of Sciences, some began to question whether the BSE was still needed at all. This was part of a general trend in the mid-20th century in which encyclopedias as a genre were sometimes criticized as being obsolete. Britannica's editors, for example, attempted around this time to reinvent the genre for a new era, as did the French novelist Raymond Queneau, editor of the Encyclopédie de la Pléiade, who had earlier claimed that, quote, the idea of a true encyclopedia is an absurdity today, unquote, since modern science has produced too many facts to include, but no unifying idea that could link the encyclopedia's contents. Of course, Soviet encyclopedists have been trying to produce an encyclopedia with a unifying idea all along. Now, Alexander Prokhorov, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist who replaced Vedinsky as editor-in-chief after his death in 1969, was able to fend off these criticisms to renew the resolution that required the Academy to assist with the encyclopedia and ultimately guide it to completion. The third edition had overall the smoothest production process, and it received the most praise from the government at the time of its completion, including personal praise from Brezhnev. It was the least revolutionary of the three editions, but perhaps accordingly, it was the most even in its coverage. Planning quickly began for a fourth edition with the goal of releasing the first volumes in 1983. However, the publisher wanted the print shop that produced the encyclopedia to be renovated and equipped with expensive imported foreign equipment, and the project struggled to gain approval. Ultimately, no fourth edition was produced, although they did produce some smaller encyclopedias throughout the 80s. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the publisher remained under state ownership, surviving financial difficulties in the tumultuous 90s by making commercial deals under the leadership of its director, Alexander Gorkin. In 1996, Boris Yeltsin issued a decree authorizing the creation of a new Great Russian Encyclopedia that was supposed to be similar in style to the smaller encyclopedias produced in the Union republics, but this was not implemented. In 2002, however, a new decree was issued by Vladimir Putin, again authorizing the creation of the Great Russian Encyclopedia, which was completed in 2017 thanks to the financial backing of the Russian state and strong personal support from Putin that kept the project alive when many other encyclopedia publishers around the world ceased to produce print editions. Today, the publisher is at work on a digital encyclopedia portal called Znania, which has been situated in opposition to Wikipedia. This project, like the Soviet Encyclopedia, is intended to present a distinctive worldview, which its editors characterize as being strictly objective and based on the analysis of primary sources, as well as to bring together Russian academia to produce a text that is the product of what they call verified credentialed writers. And both of these are, in the view of the editors, points of contrast with Wikipedia, which they always say is crowdsourced and thus unreliable, and also increasingly it's said to be anti-Russian. Putin himself has spoken of both the importance of national encyclopedias and the need to replace Wikipedia on several occasions. And this new project, if it's successful, is set to become a central part of the Russian educational and informational systems. So to conclude, I want to reiterate a point that I made earlier, which is that writing an encyclopedia is, in a very real sense, writing a world. The world that is depicted on its pages may bear a greater or lesser resemblance to the real world, and it can also be a world that one is trying to bring into existence. The BSE aimed to produce an authoritative, collectively written depiction of the world from a Marxist perspective, one that could be referenced by other works, and that could shape minds in such a way as to help bring the world on its pages into existence.
Thank you very much, Michael. A reminder that if you have a question for the speaker, please use the Q&A feature in Zoom rather than raising your hand. We will be monitoring the Q&A throughout the event. This is just a fascinating presentation. I have lots of questions, but my first one is the notion of what it was like to be an editor. And the Neshkina, who actually wrote a volume about it. So I was curious what she said about being an editor. Was it kind of a intense experience? Was it a experience where they realized that they might not get a lot of answers? How did the editors respond to creating this mammoth work?
Yes, so it was an extremely intense job to be working in, especially for the first and second editions. She describes working essentially nonstop in this journal, constantly reading new things, learning new things, having to rewrite, manuscripts that, in principle should have been, ready to publish, but, they come in and they don't meet the standards of the encyclopedia. So the editors end up having to essentially produce a whole article themselves from scratch. And of course, whenever they have to do that, that ends up creating more work for them. It ends up delaying the project in many cases. So it was a very intense experience. On the other hand, a lot of people did seem to like working there. Some, there certainly were some people who essentially were assigned to work there and couldn't wait to get out. But there's lots of people who came to the encyclopedia and worked there for as many as 30 or 40 years. And in her case, even though she left the project after about 4 years, she continued to be involved with the publisher for her whole life, basically. She contributed to many of their later projects as a writer, as an editor, helped to organize some specialized encyclopedias. But it was intense and it was stressful. Actually, just to finish answering, one of the more striking documents that I found was from the second edition in the archives, where it was just a list of all of the editors who had had heart attacks or developed other stress-related illnesses. And they sent this into the Central Committee and into the Council of Ministers, basically saying, you need to give us more people. Our people are overworked, and they're literally dying from it. So it was intense, but people liked it. It was seen as a prestigious place to work, although in some eras a dangerous place. So yeah.
The fact that there were 3 encyclopedias and a 4th kind of in the creation even today, did that mean that they really understood, or that they couldn't work all of knowledge into this huge volumes, all these volumes? Did it make it skeptical that they could actually achieve what was a very grand project?
Yeah, so you can see as
time passes, you can see some of the original kind of revolutionary fervor start to go away, especially when you get to the 3rd edition. A lot of this idea that, knowledge is being reconstructed by the project, that this is fundamentally transforming the way that people think and the way that people know things. That type of rhetoric is much less present for the 3rd edition than it was for the first 2. That being said, it was it was always a struggle, at the publisher, right? I mean, individual articles posed problems, broader approaches posed problems. And it was something that, most of the time the editors had to just work out among themselves, in the discussions that they would have, either organized discussions on boards or at production meetings. Also, discussions held by the party organization of the publisher were always very important. Those actually, in many, this was to my surprise, but in many cases, the most substantive discussions about particular approaches that needed to be taken and about areas where the work of the publisher could be improved were actually happening there at the party organization and not in the sort of editorial meetings. So yeah, it was a difficult task. Most of the people who were leading the project were committed to the idea of reconstruction. Again, as you get towards the end, that starts to change. But yeah, I think there was a strong sense of the publisher that they were engaged in something that was significant, something that really mattered, albeit something very difficult and something that they knew, they may not fully succeed in completing.
Thank you. Again, if you have a question for our speaker, please use the Q&A feature in Zoom rather than raising your hand. We have several questions already in the queue. So I'll go to Erica Gilson, who says, fascinating. Were the encyclopedias such as the one published in Azerbaijan simply translations, or did they actually include other materials?
no,
So those were most of the articles in those were being written from scratch in the Republic by scholars from that Republic. Some articles were translated, but that was a fairly small minority. And it could go the other way as well. Sometimes if the BSc needed an article about a particular some aspect of the particular republic's history of culture, they would contact the publisher in that republic and ask them to either help coordinate the production of the article or at least help find somebody who could write it. So there was a kind of reciprocal relationship happening there.
Our next question is from Tony Singleton. He asks, how does an article based on dialectical materialism differ from the bourgeois version?
Yeah, so what the editors would say is that so several things. First of all, it's supposed to show the links between the particular topic that it's examining and other topics in the encyclopedia, right? Other fields of knowledge. It's supposed to be able to integrate this particular topic into a unified Soviet philosophical worldview. There are other aspects of it too that are always stressed. So one is the link between theory and practice, right? So an article, so this especially in the 30s, this becomes something that is very heavily emphasized in the encyclopedias, that the articles have to show how the particular thing that they're talking about relates to some element of practice, whether it's industrial production or agriculture, whatever. Obviously, you can't do that on every specific topic, but in principle, the idea is there that this is something that's supposed to be done. One other thing I would say is that the design of the encyclopedia was such that the philosophical and historical content was supposed to be developed most sort of at greatest length in the longer articles. So for example, an article on physics or mathematics rather than an article about some particular physical theorem, right? Those short articles on very specific topics tended to be pretty purely factual, not very different from what you would find in any Western encyclopedia of the period. But if you go and look at, as I said, the article on physics or mathematics or philosophy, what you find is very different interpretations of the field, particularly in relation to the field's history and the field's philosophical connections with other disciplines.
Thanks. Our next question comes from Anna Whittington. She asks, I don't, she's actually in the room, but I'll ask the question for her. How did the preparers of the encyclopedia envision the use of the encyclopedia? Was it available at an accessible enough price point so that many citizens could be expected to purchase this? Her second question, and this follows on the previous answer you gave, she wants to hear more about the national non-Russian versions of the encyclopedias. Have you compared the Russian and non-Russian versions? Again, are they mere translations? Yes.
Yes. Okay. So, in relation to the first question, it was actually quite expensive, this encyclopedia. Some people were able to buy private copies, particularly if you were in a sort of job that could get you a discount on academic books. But for most people, this was a bit out of range to own a personal copy. The idea was that people would tend to encounter it more in libraries and other collective settings like that. There were some ways in which they tried to take account of the reader's preferences when the work was being created. So for the first edition, they actually conducted a survey, and that showed, first of all, it showed that a lot of the people who this encyclopedia is reaching are people who are, first of all, interested in self-education, but also people who are involved in party work. It wasn't reaching as many workers and peasants as they might have hoped, or people actively engaged in, say, industrial work. That survey also showed that the readership of the encyclopedia was extremely young. If I recall the numbers correctly, something like roughly 3/4 of their of the subscribers who returned the survey were under 30. So it had a very young, the first edition at least had a very young readership. It was quite popular. As I said, they're generally something you would not own a personal copy of unless you were fairly well off. Yes. So Oh, and then the second question. I've been doing more work on this topic recently. I've started looking into the Ukrainian and the Belarusian encyclopedias. Of course, the challenge of working with those is that they're in the languages of the republics, and so the limitation is how many of the languages of the Soviet Union can you read. But for the most part, as I said, there were some collaborations between those publishers and the BSE, but for the most part, those operated pretty independently of one another. Sometimes they were sort of standalone publishers, and sometimes they were part of the academies of science in those republics. Yeah.
Next question comes from. Next question comes from Patty, and she asks, does the content of the encyclopedias explain Putin's worldview and specifically Russia's destiny on the world stage?
So I think if you look at this new
project that's underway, the interest there is primarily in developing a particular sort of interpretation of history. So in contrast with the BSc, where philosophy of science is something that was heavily emphasized, right? These dialectical interpretations of science. For the new encyclopedia, it seems to be history where the main focus is, right? And in particular, Russian history. And as I said, there's a strong emphasis that the editors have on building up their articles from primary sources, which is something that is very different from, for example, Russian Wikipedia, because Wikipedia discourages original research, and so on Wikipedia, citations to secondary sources are considered preferable. So I do think, if you're interested in something like an official Russian worldview, looking at the development of this current project is something that will be very useful. Whether the Soviet Encyclopedia explains that is I think it, potentially if you look in terms of sort of broader kind of trajectories of Soviet knowledge, modes of thought that were common in the Soviet era that are still, reflected in these new projects, perhaps.
Sorry about that. To what extent the encyclopedias are used today? Are they still used in the education system? How would the average student or worker have engaged with the encyclopedia, if at all?
Yeah, so these are still read quite frequently today.
If you go to the Russian State Library, pretty much every reading room has copies of them on the shelves. They're also online. And in something that I find quite striking, a lot of articles on Russian Wikipedia actually draw content from the BSc, either in some cases verbatim, or at least they're taking particular, pieces of information from the encyclopedia and reusing it there. So, so it does still have readership in various ways. If you look in the Russian media, it still is cited. Both the Soviet Encyclopedia and the new Great Russian Encyclopedia are still cited for definitions and factual content. And one thing actually that my research assistant found is that in Azerbaijan, the president is quite fond of citing geographical articles from the Soviet Encyclopedia in support of Azerbaijan's territorial claims in relation to Armenia. So this is still viewed as an authoritative source in a lot of sectors in the former Soviet Union today. And if you go talk to people in Russia, I mean, a lot of people have very fond memories of reading this thing, even if they don't read it anymore. I can tell you a story. When I first showed up in Moscow, I told my landlord that I was working on this project, and she had a copy of the encyclopedia, at her other place, and was quite excited about this. She said that she considers the encyclopedia to show the true strength of the Soviet Union. So it still has a lot of admirers in Russia today, and elsewhere in the former Soviet Union.
Next question comes from Greg Yost. Were the encyclopedias entirely in text, or did they have pictures? Were there youth versions printed for elementary school students?
So they did have images, including some quite impressive maps and other illustrations that were commissioned specifically for the encyclopedia. They also drew stock photos from the major news agencies in the country as well. But yes, there were illustrations, and the number of illustrations increases from edition to edition. As far as children's encyclopedias go, that's actually quite an interesting topic. The Soviet Union did not have a children's encyclopedia until the one that was published in the Detska Encyclopedia, which was published in the late 50s and early 60s. And that's in spite of the fact that there had been quite a few efforts to produce one earlier in the Soviet period, including several attempts by Nadezhda Krupskaya, who was, of course, Lenin's wife and the sort of deputy commissar of education or enlightenment. But yes, she had convened meetings within the Pedagogical Academy to try to get such a project going, and it just never happened. That being said, children could read this encyclopedia, and there was also one called the Malaya Sovietska Encyclopedia, which is smaller, about 10 or 11 volumes, depending on the edition, and which was written at a sort of more intellectually accessible level.
We're trying to get through as many questions as we can. The next question comes from, get this up there, Connor Kiesecker. How did the author's editors address topics of colonialism and imperial expansion by the Russian Empire, particularly as it relates to histories of national groups, peoples that became part of the Soviet Union?
Yeah,
So this is a topic where the sort of trajectory tends to very much match the sort of broader trajectory of kind of national national thought in the Soviet Union. So early on you see the types of condemnations of Great Russian chauvinism, that sort of thing, and then when you get to the second edition, the early volumes of the second edition, especially when it's very much about establishing Russian priority in different areas of science, for example, and emphasizing the sort of gloriousness of Russia's history. When you get to that, then these types of this sort of thing is downplayed, right? There's not as much, it's not as critical of imperialist behavior.
We still have several questions, but I'm going to just choose a few of them. One of the questions asks how you became interested in this topic.
Yes, so I have to admit this is partially inspired by sort of interest in Wikipedia and some contemporary issues surrounding encyclopedias. In the way that they, shape, people's minds today. I mean, I think Wikipedia's, it's, I would claim the most important source of information in the world today, most influential, for better or worse. So I was very interested in seeing how these types of factors laid out in the Soviet context. So that was, also I like reading encyclopedias. So it's kind of a conjunction of those sorts of things. And it's something that lets me work on very interesting ideas in the intellectual history and history of science of the country, connecting it also with, political and cultural developments.
Next question from Ted Lang. Was there some coordination with encyclopedia projects in Eastern Europe and even communist parties in non-communist countries?
Yes, yes to both. So this starts particularly in the late 50s, but the Soviet Encyclopedia did, for example, conduct methodological seminars with publishers in other socialist countries. Usually this was done at the request of the publishers in the foreign partner. So for example, Hungary and Bulgaria both wanted to start new encyclopedias and requested help from the Soviet Encyclopedia. They also had a very interesting collaboration with Cuba that was, again, initiated by the Cuban side, to try to produce an encyclopedia that would be for people with very little formal education, written in Spanish, some volumes in Cuba and some in the USSR. They did also draw in foreign communist parties. So, for example, Togliatti from Italy wrote some stuff for the encyclopedia, although the partnerships were stronger with the leaders of communist countries that were, actually in power. Yes, and then as I mentioned, there were also some very interesting collaborations with publishers in non-communist countries, including Britannica.
What were those discussions like? I mean, what were they trying to understand how Western companies produce these encyclopedias?
Yeah, so that particular contact was initiated by William Benton, who was the publisher at the time of Britannica and former senator from Connecticut.
But he,
So originally what he wanted was statistical data that he thought the Soviet encyclopedia publisher would have, because basically Britannica had found that they did not have experts who could write about the geography of the Soviet Union. But eventually it developed into some very interesting methodological exchanges, because Britannica, as I sort of alluded to, was going through this whole project of trying to reorganize their encyclopedia and their whole publisher, and they were interested in the methodologies that the Soviet publisher was employing, to, possibly to see what could be learned from that. Similarly, the Soviet publisher was interested in finding out how Britannica did things, and in particular, they also wanted to get some books that they, would have trouble getting in the Soviet Union to import from the West. So, for example, Zlorikin, the deputy editor, went to participate in a conference in Santa Barbara that Britannica organized about what was called the technological order. And he sort of basically gave a talk about how the history of technology and sociology of technology are approached in the Soviet Union. And so by the end of these exchanges, they did sort of come to view each other as legitimate intellectual interlocutors, which was not so much the case at first. And actually, a couple articles in Britannica were prepared in the Soviet Union, including the articles on Moscow and Leningrad, which got Britannica denounced on the floors of both houses of Congress.
We're going to close this discussion, but I have one more question, and that has Vladimir Putin learned any lessons, do you think, from creating an encyclopedia? Or is he just rushing into what he remembers from his youth as an important source of information? Is he doing anything different?
Yeah, so this new online portal is really quite innovative. It's designed to incorporate spaces for discussion. It's designed to incorporate sort of different levels of analysis. So there's like the initial encyclopedia article, but then you can go deeper and get a more specialized, something like you'd find in a monograph or something you would find in say a specialized encyclopedia. It's also supposed to have these primary sources that I mentioned. Most of those features haven't been implemented in the test version of the portal. It's online now. So, when they will be implemented is, a question. Supposedly it'll be done by next year. But, as for lessons that have been learned, I think that Putin is convinced that having a national encyclopedia is something that's very important. I think he's convinced that having something that basically presents a distinctive Russian worldview is important. And I think he thinks that Wikipedia is at this point, mostly harmful, even if as he said, it does have some good information on it. And he wants an alternative to that. And this is essentially an attempt to do that. So whether it will succeed or not is something we'll see. But
well, I want to thank Michael for his excellent presentation. Thank the audience for their questions. And finally, thank the Department of State's Title VIII program for allowing us to support the work of scholars like Dr. Coates. So thank you very much, Michael. And we look forward to seeing you at future Kennan Institute events. Thanks so much.